Before we begin, we'd like to ask you to tell us your name and the city you're watching from. We love getting to know our audience. Also, please don't forget to give this video a like, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel. That way, we can keep bringing you more stories like this one. The salt air carried the stench of rotting fish and broken dreams as Captain Josiah Kane guided his ship, the Mercy's End, into the crumbling harbor of Port Augustine. Once, this place had been a thriving trading post where Spanish gold flowed like water and merchants grew fat on Caribbean commerce. Now it was little more than a graveyard for ships and souls that had nowhere else to go. A forgotten corner of the Florida Keys where the law turned a blind eye and desperate people clung to whatever scraps of life they could find. Josiah had come here not for plunder or provisions, but for the kind of anonymity that only decay could provide. At 43, he was tired. Bone-deep tired in a way that sleep couldn't cure. 25 years of piracy had carved lines around his dark eyes and turned his black hair silver at the temples, but it was the weight of accumulated sins that truly aged him. The Mercy's End carried enough Spanish gold to buy a small island, yet he felt poorer than the beggars who haunted these rotting docks. His crew of 8 men worked silently to secure the ship, their movements efficient but wary. They'd sailed with Captain Kane long enough to recognize his moods, and the black depression that had settled over him in recent months made them nervous. A melancholy pirate was a dangerous pirate, unpredictable in ways that could get them all hanged. "Captain," called out his first mate, a scarred Scotsman named Duncan who'd lost his left eye to a Spanish rapier 5 years back. "The lads are wondering about shore leave. Been at sea for 3 weeks now and they're getting restless." Josiah nodded absently, his attention caught by something in the narrow alley between the Siren's Rest Tavern and a collapsed warehouse. At first he thought it was a pile of discarded sailcloth, but then he saw movement. Small, furtive gestures that spoke of life trying to hide itself from the world's cruel gaze. "Give them their leave," he said without looking away from the alley. "But I want them back before dawn. We sail with the morning tide." Duncan followed his captain's gaze and squinted into the shadows. "Aye, Captain. What's caught your eye then?" Josiah didn't answer immediately. He'd seen poverty before. Every port in the Caribbean was crawling with it, but something about the careful way those shadows moved struck him as different. There was dignity there, a quiet desperation that suggested people trying to survive without surrendering their humanity. "Nothing that concerns you," he said finally. "See to the men." As Duncan departed with obvious reluctance, Josiah climbed down from his ship and made his way through the maze of rotting docks and abandoned buildings toward the alley. The closer he got, the clearer the scene became, and what he saw made something twist painfully in his chest. A woman sat with her back against the tavern's rear wall, her arms wrapped around 2 children, a boy of perhaps 8 and a girl who couldn't be more than 5. They were thin, all of them, with the hollow-cheeked look of people who had been hungry for a long time. Their clothes had once been respectable but now hung in tatters, carefully mended but unable to hide the poverty that had claimed them. In the woman's lap was a wooden bowl containing what looked like the dregs from the tavern's kitchen, scraps of bread soaked in the remnants of someone else's soup, potato peelings that had been boiled until they resembled food. The family was sharing these leavings with the solemnity of communion, each morsel divided equally despite the mother taking barely a bite for herself. The woman looked up as Josiah's shadow fell across them, and he found himself staring into eyes the color of storm clouds, beautiful still, despite the exhaustion and fear that clouded them. She instinctively pulled her children closer, ready to defend them against whatever new threat this stranger might represent. "Please," she said quietly, her voice carrying the faint trace of an Irish accent. "We're not causing trouble. We'll move along if you need us to." Josiah felt something crack inside his chest, a sound like ice breaking on a winter pond. When had he become the kind of man that mothers feared? When had his presence become synonymous with danger to innocence? "What's your name?" he asked, his voice gentler than it had been in years. The woman hesitated, clearly debating whether honesty or deception would serve her better. "Catherine," she said finally. "Catherine O'Brien. These are my children, Thomas and Mary." "And how long have you been eating behind taverns, Catherine O'Brien?" Her cheeks flushed with shame, but her chin lifted defiantly. "We take nothing that isn't freely given. The tavern keeper lets us have what would be thrown to the pigs anyway. That wasn't what I asked." Catherine's composure wavered for just a moment. and Josiah caught a glimpse of the desperation she was fighting so hard to hide. 3 months, she whispered, since the fever took my husband and the landlord put us out for non-payment of rent. The little girl, Mary, chose that moment to look up at Josiah with enormous blue eyes that reminded him painfully of his sister, dead these 20 years in a British raid on their Irish village. "Are you here to take Mama away?" she asked with the heartbreaking directness of a child. "No, little one," Josiah said, crouching down so he was at her eye level. "I'm not here to take anyone away." He studied the small family, noting details that painted a clearer picture of their circumstances. Catherine's hands bore the calluses of honest work. She'd been a washerwoman, perhaps, or a seamstress. Her children, despite their poverty, were clean and well-behaved, suggesting a mother who refused to let circumstances steal their dignity. Most tellingly, there was love here, fierce, protective love that had kept them together when the world seemed determined to tear them apart. "Where will you sleep tonight?" Josiah asked. "There's a place," Catherine said vaguely, and he knew without asking that it would be another alley, another doorway, where they could huddle together and try to stay warm. Josiah Kane had done terrible things in his life. He'd killed men in cold blood, burned ships with their crews still aboard, stolen enough gold to ransom kingdoms. He'd convinced himself that mercy was weakness, that compassion was luxury he couldn't afford. But looking at this woman and her children, something stirred in the ruins of his soul. Something he'd thought had died years ago in the smoke and blood of his own family's destruction. "No," he said simply. Catherine blinked in confusion. "I beg your pardon?" Josiah stood and extended his hand to her. "I said no. You won't be sleeping in doorways tonight or any other night." His voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed, but it was gentled by something that might have been kindness. "Get your things. You're coming home." The word surprised him almost as much as they surprised her. Home. He hadn't used that word in 20 years. Hadn't thought he remembered what it meant. But looking at this broken family, he suddenly understood that home wasn't a place. It was a choice. A decision to protect something precious even when you had no right to it. "I don't understand," Catherine whispered. "You will," Josiah said. "My ship is clean, warm, and safe. My cook prepares enough food to feed twice my crew, and there are empty cabins that could use the sound of children's laughter." He paused, then added with brutal honesty, "I'm a pirate, Mrs. O'Brien. I've done things that would turn your hair white. But I give you my word, my sacred oath, that no harm will come to you or your children while you're under my protection." Catherine stared at him for a long moment, her storm-gray eyes searching his face for deception or hidden motives. What she saw there must have satisfied her, because she slowly took his offered hand and allowed him to help her to her feet. "Why?" she asked simply. Josiah looked down at little Mary, who was still clutching a crust of bread as if it were precious treasure, and felt the last of his carefully constructed walls crumble to dust. "Because," he said quietly, "everyone deserves to be someone's safe harbor." The Mercy's End was nothing like Catherine had imagined a pirate ship would be. She'd expected something dark and menacing, reeking of rum and violence, but instead found herself aboard a vessel that was surprisingly clean and well-maintained. The deck planks were scrubbed white, the brass fittings gleamed in the moonlight, and everything had its proper place with the precision of a military vessel. Captain Kane led them through the ship with the quiet authority of a man completely at home in his domain. Catherine kept Thomas and Mary close, one hand on each of their shoulders, still half convinced this was some elaborate trap. But as they descended into the ship's belly, she began to understand that whatever else Josiah Kane might be, he was a man who took care of what belonged to him. "This will be your cabin," he said, opening a door to reveal a space larger than the single room they'd shared in their boarding house. 2 hammocks hung from the ceiling, and there was a proper window, porthole, she corrected herself, that looked out over the harbor. "It's not luxurious, but it's dry and secure." Mary immediately ran to the porthole, pressing her small face against the glass. "Mama, look, I can see the water." "It's beautiful, sweetheart," Catherine said softly, though her attention remained fixed on their unlikely benefactor. In the lamplight she could see him more clearly, the strong jaw marked by old scars, the dark eyes that seemed to hold depths of both cruelty and unexpected kindness, the way his hands moved with practiced efficiency, even in simple gestures. "Thomas, Mary," Kane said, crouching down to their level again. "Are you hungry? Truly hungry? For real food?" Both children nodded solemnly, and Catherine felt her cheeks burn with shame. When had her babies become so careful about expressing their needs, so resigned to disappointment? Then we'll remedy that immediately. Kane stood and moved to the door. "Cook," he bellowed, his voice carrying the authority of absolute command. "Cook to me." Within moments, a round-faced man with arms like tree trunks appeared, wiping his hands on a stained apron. "Aye, Captain." "Mr. Harris, we have guests. I want a proper meal prepared. Something suitable for children who haven't eaten well in some time. And coffee, real coffee, not the swill we usually brew." Cook Harris looked curiously at Catherine and the children, but there was no judgment in his expression, only professional interest. "Aye, Captain. Might I suggest starting with something light? Broth and bread perhaps, then work up to heartier fare. Their stomachs won't take kindly to rich food straight away." Kane nodded approvingly. "Good thinking. See to it." As Harris departed, Catherine found her voice. "Captain Kane, I must ask again, why are you doing this? You don't know us. You owe us nothing." Kane was quiet for a long moment, staring out the porthole at the dark water beyond. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain. "I had a sister once, bright as a new penny, with eyes just like your Mary's. When the British came to our village, He stopped, his jaw working as if the words were too difficult to speak. "Let's just say I learned early that the world has little mercy for the innocent." "I'm sorry," Catherine said softly. "So am I." Kane turned back to face her. "But sorrow without action is just self-pity. Tonight I can ensure that 2 children sleep with full bellies in warm beds. Tomorrow," he shrugged, "tomorrow we'll see what tomorrow brings." Cook Harris returned with a tray bearing bowls of rich-smelling broth, fresh bread still warm from the galley, and a pot of coffee that filled the cabin with its aromatic promise. Catherine watched her children eat with the focused intensity of the truly hungry, and felt tears threaten for the first time in weeks. "Slowly now," she murmured, though it broke her heart to restrain them. "Small bites." Kane poured coffee into 2 cups and handed one to Catherine. The liquid was dark and strong and perfect, and she had to close her eyes against the pleasure of it. How long had it been since she'd tasted real coffee? "Your husband," Kane said quietly, settling into a chair across from her. "What did he do?" "He was a clerk for a shipping company. Good with numbers, good with people." Catherine's voice grew soft with memory. "He came here from Boston when the company expanded their Caribbean operations. We met at a church social, married 6 months later." She smiled sadly. "He used to say I was the treasure he found in paradise." "And the fever took him quickly?" "Too quickly. One day he was laughing with the children, the next he was burning up with it. The doctor said there was nothing to be done, that it was God's will." Her voice turned bitter. "God's will that a good man should die and leave his family to starve." Kane sipped his coffee, considering her words. "I stopped believing in God's will a long time ago. But I still believe in chance and choices, in the possibility that sometimes the world surprises us." Thomas looked up from his broth, his young face serious. "Are you really a pirate, sir?" "Thomas," Catherine gasped, but Kane held up a hand. "It's a fair question." He met the boy's gaze directly. "Yes, lad, I am. I've sailed under the black flag for most of my life, taken ships and treasure, fought battles on the high seas. Have you ever killed anyone?" The question was asked with the morbid curiosity of childhood, but Kane's expression grew grave. "Yes," he said simply, "I have, and every one of those deaths weighs on my soul." Mary looked up from her bread, her blue eyes wide. "Does that make you a bad man?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a cannon blast. Kane was quiet for so long that Catherine began to think he wouldn't answer at all. "I think," he said finally, "that good and bad aren't as simple as we'd like them to be. I've done terrible things, but I've also tried to follow certain rules. Never harm the innocent, never take more than I need, never kill a man who wasn't trying to kill me first." He paused. "Whether that makes me good or bad, I suppose history will be the judge." "What about your crew?" Catherine asked. "What will they think of you bringing strangers aboard?" Kane's expression darkened slightly. "They'll think what I tell them to think. But," he seemed to wrestle with something internal, "I won't lie to you, Mrs. O'Brien. Some of them won't be pleased. Pirates aren't known for their charitable nature, and they might see you as a liability, a weakness to be exploited. Then perhaps we should—" "No." Kane's voice cut through her protest like a blade. "You're under my protection now, and that means something on this ship. Any man who has a problem with my decisions can take it up with me personally. There was something in his tone that suggested such conversations would be brief and decisive. Catherine found herself both comforted and slightly frightened by the steel in his voice. As the children finished their meal, their eyelids began to droop with the satisfied exhaustion of the well-fed. Kane noticed and stood. "I'll leave you to get them settled. We sail before dawn, so try to get some rest." "Captain Kane," Catherine called as he reached the door. "Where are we going?" He paused, his hand on the doorframe. "Somewhere safe," he said. "Somewhere you can start over, build a new life." He looked back at her, and she caught something vulnerable in his expression. "Somewhere we can all start over, perhaps." After he left, Catherine helped her children into the hammocks, marveling at how quickly they fell asleep on their full stomachs. She sat in the chair Kane had vacated, listening to the gentle creaking of the ship and the distant sounds of the crew preparing for departure. Through the porthole, she could see lights moving on other ships, the eternal dance of maritime life continuing around them. Somewhere out there was the future, uncertain, possibly dangerous, but no longer hopeless. For the first time in months, Catherine O'Brien allowed herself to believe that tomorrow might be better than today. On deck above, Josiah Kane stood at the wheel of his ship and stared out at the dark horizon. Behind him, he could hear his crew murmuring among themselves, their voices carrying questions and concerns he wasn't ready to address. Ahead lay open water and the promise of complications he couldn't yet imagine. But in the cabin below, 2 children slept peacefully for the first time in months, and their mother sat watching over them with something that might have been hope flickering in her storm-gray eyes. For a man who had spent 25 years taking from the world, the simple act of giving felt like the first honest thing he'd done in decades. The Mercy's End had earned her name in blood and violence, but tonight she carried a different kind of cargo, the fragile possibility of redemption, and the revolutionary idea that even the most broken souls could learn to protect instead of destroy. Dawn broke gray and uncertain as the Mercy's End cleared the harbor of Port Augustine, her sails filling with the steady trade winds that would carry them north toward the Bahamas. Catherine stood at the rail with Thomas and Mary, watching the ramshackle port disappear into the morning haze, and felt a mixture of relief and terror at leaving the only home her children had ever known. The crew moved around them with professional efficiency, but she could feel their eyes, curious, suspicious, sometimes openly hostile. These were hard men who had chosen a life outside society's rules, and the presence of a woman and children clearly disturbed the careful balance of their floating world. "Mama," Mary whispered, tugging at Catherine's skirt. "That man keeps staring at us." Catherine followed her daughter's gaze to where a lean, scarred pirate was coiling rope near the mainmast. His eyes were cold and calculating, and when he caught her looking, his mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "That's Jenkins," said a voice behind them. Catherine turned to find Duncan, the one-eyed first mate Kane had introduced the night before. "Don't mind him none. He's got opinions about women on ships, but he'll keep them to himself if he knows what's good for him." "And if he doesn't?" Catherine asked. Duncan's remaining eye crinkled with dark humor. "Well, let's just say the captain's been in a particular mood lately. Not the sort of mood a man wants to test." As if summoned by their conversation, Kane appeared at Catherine's side, his presence immediately shifting the atmosphere on deck. The hostile stares became carefully neutral expressions, and the crew's movements took on a more purposeful quality. "How did you sleep?" Kane asked, his attention focused entirely on Catherine and the children. "Better than we have in months," Catherine admitted. "The children are already asking when they can explore the ship." Kane's expression softened as he looked down at Thomas and Mary. "There'll be time for that once we're well clear of land. For now, it's best they stay close to you." His voice dropped lower. "Some of the crew need time to adjust to new circumstances." "They don't want us here," Catherine said quietly. "What they want is irrelevant. You're here under my protection, and that's the end of it." Kane's voice carried absolute authority, but Catherine caught the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand rested casually near his sword hilt. The morning passed peacefully enough, with Catherine and the children staying near their cabin while the crew went about their duties. Cook Harris brought them a proper breakfast of eggs and salt pork, along with fresh fruit that tasted like paradise after months of scraps. But as the sun climbed higher, Catherine began to sense growing unrest among the crew. It came to a head just after the noon meal. Catherine was teaching Mary to read from a small prayer book she'd managed to keep when a commotion erupted on deck. Through the porthole, she could see men gathering near the mainmast, their voices raised in heated discussion. "Stay here with Mary," she told Thomas, and despite his protests, she slipped out of the cabin to see what was happening. "Brought a curse on us all," Jenkins was saying, his voice carrying clearly across the deck. "Women and children on a pirate ship? It's madness." "The captain's lost his mind," another voice agreed. "Gone soft, he has. First he stops us from taking that Spanish treasure ship last month, now this." Duncan stood facing the group, his hand on his cutlass. "That's enough talk. The captain's decisions are his own." "Are they?" Jenkins stepped forward, his scarred face twisted with anger. "When those decisions put us all at risk? When they make us targets for every navy that wants to hang pirates? What's the meaning of this?" Kane's voice cut through the argument like a blade through silk. The crew fell silent as he strode across the deck, his dark eyes taking in every face, every stance, every hand near a weapon. "I asked a question," Kane said softly, and somehow that quiet tone was more menacing than any shout. Jenkins, either braver or more foolish than the others, stepped forward. "We're concerned, Captain, about the direction this crew is heading, about decisions that affect us all." "My decisions," Kane said, "have kept you alive and wealthy for 5 years. Have I given you cause to doubt my judgment?" "You've changed," Jenkins pressed. "Ever since that business with the Spanish ship, you've been different, softer, and now this, taking in strays like some charity house." The silence that followed was profound. Catherine could hear nothing but the creak of rigging and the whisper of wind through the sails. Kane stood perfectly still, and she realized she was witnessing something dangerous, a moment when leadership would either be reaffirmed or challenged. "Mr. Jenkins," Kane said finally, his voice still soft but carrying undertones of steel. "Do you wish to challenge my authority?" Jenkins hesitated, perhaps realizing he'd pushed further than he'd intended, but pride and anger drove him forward. "I'm speaking for the crew. We signed on to follow a pirate captain, not a nursemaid." Kane nodded slowly, as if considering the point. Then, faster than Catherine's eye could follow, his sword was in his hand and at Jenkins' throat. "Let me clarify something for you," Kane said conversationally. "I am still the same man who carved his name in blood across the Caribbean, the same man who took the Spanish treasure fleet at Port Royal single-handed, the same man who's never lost a battle or backed down from a fight." The sword pressed slightly deeper, drawing a thin line of blood. "The fact that I choose to show mercy to the innocent doesn't make me weak. It makes me selective." Jenkins' eyes were wide with fear now, all his bluster evaporating. "Captain, you have a choice," Kane continued. "Accept my authority and the presence of my guests, or challenge me properly and face the consequences. But this middle ground of muttered complaints and sideways challenges ends now." The standoff stretched for an eternal moment. Then Jenkins slowly nodded, and Kane withdrew his blade. "Good," Kane said, sheathing his sword with fluid grace. "Now, are there any other concerns about my leadership that need addressing?" The crew shook their heads hastily, and Kane's expression relaxed slightly. "Excellent. Mr. Duncan, set course for Nassau. We have business there that's been too long delayed." As the crew dispersed, Kane's eyes found Catherine where she stood by the cabin door. Something passed between them, understanding, perhaps, or recognition of the delicate balance he was maintaining for her sake. That evening, as the children slept and the ship sailed through calm seas under a canopy of stars, Catherine found Kane at the stern rail, staring out at their wake. "You protected us today," she said simply. "I protected what's mine," Kane replied. "There's a difference." Catherine considered this, then moved to stand beside him at the rail. "Is that what we are now? Yours?" Kane was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know what you are," he said finally. "I only know that seeing you and your children hungry and cold made something wake up inside me that I thought was dead. And now that it's awake," he shrugged, "I find I can't go back to sleep." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. In the distance, phosphorescence glittered in their wake like scattered stars, beautiful and mysterious in the tropical night. 3 weeks into their voyage, the Mercy's End approached Nassau Harbor under skies heavy with the promise of storm. The infamous pirate stronghold sprawled across the shoreline like a fever dream. Ramshackle buildings climbing the hillsides, ships of every description crowding the harbor, and the constant buzz of activity that marked a place where laws were suggestions and violence was currency. Catherine stood at the rail with her children, watching this legendary den of thieves grow larger with each passing moment. Thomas pressed close to her side, his 8-year-old mind struggling to process the reality of entering a pirate port, while Mary clutched her mother's hand with the instinctive fear of a child sensing danger. "It's bigger than I expected," Catherine murmured to Kane, who had joined them at the rail. "Nassau is the last free port in the Caribbean," Kane replied, his eyes scanning the harbor with the practiced assessment of a man who had survived by reading threats before they materialized. "No government holds sway here. It's ruled by whoever has the strongest crew and the fastest guns." The harbor bristled with pirate vessels, their Jolly Rogers snapping in the tropical breeze like declarations of war against the civilized world. Catherine counted at least 30 ships, each representing a crew of desperate men who had chosen outlawry over obedience. "Stay close to me once we dock," Kane instructed quietly. "Nassau has its own rules, but those rules don't extend much protection to the innocent." The Mercy's End slid into her berth with practiced ease, and immediately they were surrounded by the controlled chaos of a pirate port. Kane's crew moved with heightened alertness, their weapons visible and their eyes constantly scanning for threats. "Captain Kane!" The voice boomed across the dock, and Catherine turned to see a massive man approaching. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, his dark skin marked with ritual scars and his beard braided with gold coins. "Welcome back to Nassau, Captain Thorne," Kane replied with careful politeness. "I see you're still terrorizing merchant vessels. And what have we here?" Thorne's eyes fixed on Catherine and the children. "The legendary Josiah Kane traveling with passengers? How unexpected. Mrs. O'Brien and her children are under my personal protection," Kane said quietly, and something in his tone made several nearby pirates step back. "Of course," Thorne said, though his smile never reached his eyes. "Your guests are welcome in Nassau, naturally, though I confess curiosity about this new, charitable endeavor of yours." That evening, as Catherine helped her children settle into their cabin aboard ship, she heard voices from the deck above. Moving quietly to the porthole, she could see Kane in heated discussion with several of his crew. "Madness, Captain," she heard Jenkins saying, "bringing them here, to Nassau of all places." "Because," Kane said finally, his voice carrying across the water, "for 25 years I've taken from this world. Ships, treasure, lives. I've been nothing but a force of destruction, and I'm tired, lads. Tired of waking up every morning knowing I'll add to the sum of human misery before the sun sets." There was a long silence before Duncan spoke. "And you think playing nursemaid to some Irish widow will balance the scales?" "I think," Kane said quietly, "that maybe it's not too late to become something other than what I've been. Maybe it's not too late to build instead of destroy, to protect instead of plunder." The next morning brought crisis. Kane burst into their cabin, his face grim with purpose. "Pack quickly," he said without preamble. "We're leaving within the hour." "What's happened?" Catherine asked, already moving to gather their few possessions. "Thorne's made his play. He's claiming that you and the children are stolen property, that I took you from a plantation in Jamaica." Kane's jaw was tight with anger. "It's nonsense, but in Nassau might makes right. He's got 40 men to my 8. On deck, Captain Thorne stood surrounded by his men, his massive frame radiating confident menace. Kane's crew had formed a defensive line, but they were outnumbered nearly 3-1. "Ah, Kane!" Thorne called out jovially. "I was just explaining the situation regarding your passengers." "There is no situation," Kane replied evenly. "Mrs. O'Brien and her children are free people under my protection." "Free people?" Thorne's laugh boomed across the harbor. "Everyone here belongs to someone, Kane. The question is whether they belong to you or to me." Catherine stepped forward before Kane could respond, her chin lifted with aristocratic dignity. "Captain Thorne," she said in her clear Irish accent, "I am Catherine O'Brien, widow of Patrick O'Brien of Boston. My children and I came aboard this ship of our own free will, seeking passage to a new life. We are not property to be claimed or disputed." Thorne's eyes glittered with predatory interest. "A pretty speech, my dear. But I have witnesses who will swear you were taken from the Morrison plantation in Jamaica, that you and your children are escaped slaves." "Then your witnesses are liars," Catherine replied calmly. "But more than that, they're fools. Do I look like a woman who has spent her life in bondage? Do my children speak like plantation slaves?" She gestured to Thomas and Mary. "I'm educated, Captain Thorne. I can read and write in 3 languages, keep accounts, navigate by the stars. I was married in St. Patrick's Cathedral in Boston. The silence stretched taut. Thorne's claim crumbled in the face of Catherine's obvious breeding and education. Several of his own men were looking uncomfortable, perhaps realizing they'd been asked to participate in an obvious lie. Clever words, Thorne growled. But you think too much, Kane interrupted, his voice carrying cold authority. Mrs. O'Brien has made her position clear. She and her children are under my protection. Any man who disputes that can take the matter up with me personally. The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a cannon blast. Thorne was larger and stronger, but Kane's reputation was built on speed and skill, not brute force. This isn't over, Thorne said finally, stepping back toward the gangplank. Yes, Kane replied quietly. It is. That night, as the Mersey's End sailed out of Nassau under cover of darkness, Catherine found Kane at the wheel, steering them toward open ocean and whatever future awaited. Thank you, she said simply. You saved yourself today, Kane replied. I just provided the platform. Catherine moved to stand beside him, close enough to feel the warmth of his presence in the cool night air. Where are we going? Kane looked out at the star-filled horizon. North, he said. Away from the pirates and the politics. Somewhere you can build the life you want for your children. And what about the life you want? Kane was quiet for so long that Catherine thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible above the wind. For 25 years I thought I knew what I wanted. Gold, respect, freedom to take what I pleased. He paused. But watching you stand up to Thorne today, seeing your children smile at breakfast this morning, I'm beginning to think I've been wanting the wrong things. Catherine reached out and covered his hand with hers where it gripped the wheel. It's never too late to want different things, Josiah. It's never too late to choose a different path. Behind them, Nassau disappeared into the tropical darkness. Ahead lay the vast Atlantic and the promise of transformation, not just for Catherine and her children, but for a man learning that redemption was possible, even for those who thought they were beyond saving. The Mersey's End cut through the waves toward a horizon bright with stars and endless possibility, carrying within her hull the revolutionary idea that home was not a place, but a choice, made new each day, to protect what was precious and build what was good.